We can move into the Inquisition.
Oh dear.
So the Inquisition is another of your
Are you threatening me now?
This is another of your great works. It was published originally in 1965 and critically acclaimed as the most important work on the Inquisition, and very important because it was very provocative, and it made us think about the Inquisition from a totally different perspective. Basically, obviously I'm over summarizing here, but basically you say that the Inquisition wasn't that bad. It was probably more systematic than other systems of should we say, repression or persecution for religious reasons. So, what was this must have been created such an impact in historiography when you published this, didn't it?
Yes, apparently it started modern Inquisition studies, because later on I went to lots of conferences and so on, and yes, it helped Inquisition studies to take off. But the trouble with all of these studies, as you know, as a scholar yourself, is that they all take off in different directions, and sometimes the directions are crazy. So with the Inquisition, which is such a provocative subject, there were always people who are bound to try and study aspects of it which unbalanced the perspective that I was trying to achieve of the Inquisition. With the result is that within a few years after the publication of my book, Inquisition studies took off in wildly different directions. For example, Jewish historians, I mean Israeli historians, plus historians in the United States of America, went off in one direction, insisting that the Inquisition was a concern only of Jewish people, and that they had virtually no impact on other people. Now that tended to distort the studies. Then there were others who felt, because the Inquisition was responsible for deaths and so on, that they could compile statistics about this. And so some young professors got together and compiled statistics, which were so unacceptable that they were very quickly dropped. I mean, nobody quotes them now because those statistics are no longer acceptable. In other words, it provoked a large amount of research and interest, but I'm not sure that it took us any closer to finding an equilibrium, a balance in the way we approach our view of the historical impact, in this case, of the Inquisition on the people of Spain.
Right. Mm-hmm. But would it be fair to conclude as a result of this research that there was no more religious persecution in Spain than in other parts of Europe in the 16th and 17th century?
Oh yes, much less religious persecution. That is the fact. That is the fact. Hundreds of times, you could multiply by hundreds the amount of people who died in foreign countries as against those who died in Spain as a result of religious persecution, especially in the epoch of the Reformation. For example, a simple figure given, which is more or less correct, is that in the whole lifetime of the Inquisition, over 400 years, it probably was responsible for the execution of maybe about 3,000 people. Whereas we know that on one single night in France in August 1572, 30,000 people were killed between Catholics and Protestants. So, you know, the comparison is, and not to mention the English thing, the English kept killing, but later the figures don't appear so often in print. It's true that the Spanish were not so much of a persecuting people at that period or even before. But those who don't wish to accept this, because they don't want excuses to be made for the Inquisition, would say that there were other methods which the Inquisition used in order to oppress people. Namely, it prohibited people from thinking, it prohibited people from reading, it prohibited people from traveling, and so on and so forth. It becomes terribly complex, you know, as soon as you enter into this. With the result that I've recently, last year, published the latest version of my book on the Inquisition, because research has advanced quite a deal, and we are forced to change our conclusions as a result of the way we look at the Inquisition. It's a very rich subject. It still needs a lot of revision, but it will still give rise to these contradictory approaches to how it functioned.
On the other hand, you pose yourself the question of how could this have happened in a society that had once practiced convivencia, the harmonious coexistence of Christians, Muslims and Jews. And isn't this because of another myth, really, that medieval Spain was less tolerant than it was commonly supposed?
Yes, true, but once again, in an attempt to define what the coexistence of different cultures is, we end up looking at a very complex situation. And I find, for practical purposes, and indeed it's one of the approaches I used in this latest version of the Inquisition, for practical purposes, the best way to try and study the way that the cultures had or did not have conflicts in Spain is to compare Spain as closely as possible with the Balkans under Muslim rule, with North Africa under Muslim rule, and with the islands of the Eastern Mediterranean under Muslim rule. And there we'll find that there is a situation which is very similar to that of Spain, in which there's very little persecution, a lot of coexistence, and there is no need to emphasize whether one country is worse than another in its persecution. It is simply that, and I keep emphasizing the word Mediterranean here. I think that those of us who live in the Mediterranean tend to have a more equanimity, I don't know how that is in English even.
Balanced.
A more balanced way of approaching living together. Mainly because of the sunshine, which they don't have so much in England. But I do believe that in a more equable climate, such as the Mediterranean, there is the possibility of a greater coexistence than there is in those darker countries in the north of Europe, like England, Holland, Germany, and so on, where you get the most horrifying persecution, especially during the epoch of the witch persecutions of the 16th and 17th centuries.
Right. Now let's move on to another major topic.